being here today. We are about to embark on yet another controversial subject in politics, and that is the role of the media in American politics. It's a very controversial topic, but it's one that has a very serious effect on how we are governed and by whom. I told Luis that I would remind you that the opinions expressed here today are not necessarily those of Young Harris College or ICF. So whatever is said is the opinion of those speaking, including myself. As usual, I encourage you to ask questions at any time. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We will recognize you and try to answer the question as soon as we can. The reason we like to do it that way is to keep everybody from asking questions at the same time. How many of you tuned in to Fox television on Sunday night and saw the interview of President Clinton by Chris Wallace? Well, I'm glad to see you're a very observant audience. That interview was billed as a discussion on global warming. It turned out to be a shouting match with Clinton doing most of the shouting.
Amen.
Seems Wallace got in the former president's wheelhouse by insinuating that he failed to eliminate bin Laden, and as a result, the war on terror suffered and resulted in the attack on 9/11. My observation was that Clinton obviously didn't have James Carville around, because if he did, Carville would never have allowed him to go on that program. Carville knows, as Clinton should have known, that Fox News is about as likely to ask Clinton a softball question as Wolf Blitzer and CNN are in praising President Bush. But I did this as a part of my research that I keep ongoing in newspapers and television and radio to determine, if I can, what effect their news might have on the American public. And in Sunday night, I got what I was looking for right quick, because in the middle of that interview, as you'll recall, Wallace took time out for a commercial break. You remember that? Mm-hmm. And the commercial was sponsored by a group known as Progress for America, which is an organization that promotes patriotism, which we all appreciate. We all are patriots. We all want our country to win. We all want us to be united in all of our efforts. The feature was a general by the name of Emil Bethard, who is a retired 3-star general who was stationed at the Pentagon during 9/11. And in his remarks on that commercial, he outlined all of the previous terrorist attacks on American interests around the world and insinuated that Clinton did nothing to stop them. Now, my question was that commercial interruption a coincidence or a planned attempt to assist Chris Wallace in his criticism of Clinton?
Well, you got to remember the background of Fox News to begin with.
We're getting to that. We're getting to that. I don't want to give you the impression that I'm a defender of Clinton or that I am a defender of Fox News. What I want to say to you is that the media, without a doubt, can most assuredly manipulate the news and does so without fear or conscience. And that's what we want to talk about today. Hopefully we can answer these questions. Do the media manipulate politics? Question 2. Do politicians manipulate the media? And to help us answer those questions, we will have as our guest the Dean of Georgia's Political Reporters and Observers, Mr. Bill Shipp, of whom I'm sure many of you have heard. Bill writes an award-winning column for 60 Georgia newspapers twice weekly. And he appears on a weekly television program in Atlanta called The Georgia Gang. And he'll be with us after our break. Sometimes I shudder when I think of the powerful hold mass media has on you and me and our fellow Americans. They have changed the way we think. They've changed the way we vote. And they've changed the way we're governed. One analyst that I was reading the other night went so far as to say that the media are responsible for declining voter turnout, growing disenchantment with government, and weakening of political parties. Yet, they are an intricate part, as you know, of our daily lives. The news and the opinions that are expressed by the media certainly influences the outcome of elections, as well as the public's attitude toward the government. And I can tell you, after having spent many years in government and corporate life, that I have never seen such a low opinion that people have about their government. Whether or not it's deserved is a matter of individual judgment, I would think, but it's there. I was talking with a friend of mine who worked with me at the Atlanta Journal years ago, and I was telling him what we wanted to do here today. And he told me this, and I wrote it down, and I want to read it to you, because I think it's important. He says that American media may not always be successful telling their readers and listeners what to think, but they're absolutely stunningly successful in telling what to think about. And I think that's very true. When we think of the media, we think of a big mass out there, a conglomerate of news outlets that we must depend on for news, and sometimes for opinion and for other things. But we fail sometimes to realize that the media is divided into several groups. First of all, you have the print. That's your newspapers, magazines, the scandal sheets in the grocery store, and that sort of thing. And then there's the broadcast media, which is television and radio, and of late, movies. We have seen a number of movies that have been produced with political themes. We have seen more and more movie stars get involved in politics. And we are now, I think, at the point where we must pay attention to the World Wide Web and to the internet. Because the blogs that you can find there nowadays are amazingly political. They're either pro-Archon government, pro-Archon politicians, they're pro-Archon just about everything that you can imagine. I do want to make, before we get into the meat of this, one observation that I think is important. And that is that unlike the broadcast medium, the press is protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution. The government has no regulatory power over a newspaper's ability to write news, issue their opinions or make recommendations. No government regulatory power at all. But it does have regulatory power over television, and I think soon the internet. But based on the theory that air belongs to the people, and what happens in that air is of interest to the government and the Federal Communications Commission. I was thinking the other day about World War II, when we sat by the radio in Clayton, Georgia, listening to the reports of Edward R. Murrow. At that time, he was a very distinguished broadcaster who was on the front lines and sent all the news back home. But the news was not always good, but we had confidence in his integrity. And we believed what he said, even though we didn't want to hear it. So having had that experience, I can truthfully say to you that I do not get a warm and fuzzy feeling today when I sit down before the television in the evenings and watch the television news. Murrow, for example, he simply told you what was going on in the war and what our soldiers were doing. And we believed it. And unlike most of today's commentators, he offered no editorial comment. He didn't question our government's role in the war, nor did he praise or criticize the generals who were in charge of fighting the war. And then I thought of good old Walter Cronkite. Remember Walter Cronkite?
Yes, sir.
Walter Cronkite told us twice, every day, in a very calm and persuasive way. That's the way it is. With unbiased and factual news and his signature sign-off. Then I remembered seeing, for the first time, the violence and the death, the Vietnam War on television. It was shocking, period, to me. We've never seen that before. We've never had a medium that could bring that kind of news right into our living rooms. Later, we all, I'm sure, were shocked by violence in the streets, bloodshed from demonstrators who opposed the war, even street fights at our political conventions, all aired in our living rooms by television. We were also told that some of these violent maneuvers were staged for filming for television stations so they could improve their national ratings. Now that's true, and really I have no reason to believe it wasn't. Then that is clearly sensationalizing news. And that is not the purpose of the print media or the broadcast media. News is news. It's what you see. It's what you hear. And you report that. You don't stage it. You shouldn't stage it. And we're told by media experts that bias in the media is unavoidable. They say that deadline pressures limited print space. The difficulty of making a good story in a short period of time. Inaccuracies in reporting. Unidentified sources that tell the truth. All of these things, they say, are the reason for distortions and inaccuracies in the news. Should we buy that? Should we believe that? Or should we cling to the belief that the main function of the media is to inform and analyze the news while being accountable, while being fair, while being unprejudiced, and while being truthful. I was always taught that the canons of good journalism demand that the media research both sides of an issue. Unfortunately, we don't see too much of that today. The mass media have many opportunities to slant or to falsely balance news. One example is what is known as framing. Let's talk, I have some examples here. Let's talk for a moment about framing. Framing means the way news is packaged, where it's placed, the size of the headlines, the use of photographs, and in case of the television medium, the background material and the pictures they use, the auditory and visual effects. Now, I have here two examples of what can be defined as framing. The first is a story about a local politician who is running for re-election, which appeared on the front page of his weekly magazine, weekly newspaper, lauding him, acclaiming him a great person because he introduced the bill last January. Now, that is not timely used, but it's not the only. It's not the only example. I hold here yet another from a newspaper from a bordering county, written by a state senator who is up for re-election, which states her position on about every matter under the sun. It was given big billing in this newspaper, yet it never mentions her opponent. So what we have here is a case of newspapers deciding that they're going to run campaigns in their counties for their local candidates without giving the people an opportunity to view their opponents. That is, of course, politicians love that. Keeps their names on the front page, and the best of all is free, but it's unfair. Now, another example of framing is positioning. And I saw this yesterday. This is yesterday's Journal-Constitution. It has a front page story on the Iraq War, and when you turn the page, you will see the upper right-hand portion of the newspaper, which is what the eye sees first. That story is about Senator Clinton taking on her husband's opponents and raising sand with just about everybody for the interview he had. Now, it's obvious that the newspaper wanted you to see that and wanted you to read that. So they placed it in a position where you can't miss it. Now, if it were on the other side of the page, or if it were at the bottom of the page, next to this nice ad here, you probably would pass it by. That is known as framing. And it's a technique that newspapers use in order to plug their favorite candidates. It's quite common. It's not fair. And I don't think it measures up to the standard of good, fair political coverage. Now, another form of manipulating news is what we call labeling, which you all heard, I'm sure, and which both mediums use constantly. You can put a positive label, or you can put a negative label on a candidate. Some examples of positive labels. Leading candidate without explanation why he or she is leading. strong on terrorism, which applies that the opponent is not. The man or woman to beat without telling why, without giving poll results or some reason why that individual is the candidate to beat. Negative labels are also very common. Tax and spend, that's what Republicans like to say about Democrats. Right-wing conspirators, that's what Democrats like to say about Republicans. Weak on defense, which was a label President Bush used in his campaign against John Kerry, and so on. Also, a very widely used label is the word reform. How many times have you heard the word reform? The media uses that word to suggest that somebody is making improvements in programs and governmental efforts when it's not true at all. A reform might result in loss of funding, a cut in services, a lot of things that shouldn't happen. But they truly fit the label of reform because that's what the media makes it look like. Tax reform. How many times over the years of your lifetime have you heard the word tax reform, which allegedly reduces taxes? But in truth, about all it does is to shift the burden, depending on the attitude of the Congress at the time. Welfare reform, tax reform. When you see the word reform, investigate. Now, there's also a practice that we all go through called front loading. Front loading means compressing too many primaries. Come in, George. We're about ready for you, George. If you got the main man, George,
Gray hair.
yeah. But we're talking, George, now about front-loading elections. I know you're very much aware of that, candidate and a great public servant. But when you look at our presidential primaries, reporters nowadays tell you who's winning and who's losing 2 years in advance, and they don't know any more about it than you do. They probably know a whole lot more about it than I do. But they insist on telling you who the front runners are and who's going to get elected 2 years in advance. And that kind of coverage, at best, is a farce, unless every candidate in the race is a multi-millionaire or has the ability to raise a lot of money in a short period of time. James Carville one time told me that a successful presidential contender must go into New Hampshire with at least $30 million or lose in the mega states where you have to spend money to compete for delegates. And as you can well imagine, this process is slowly cutting out the average American, because a handful of people can create candidates almost overnight. And they do it with fundraising and local support groups that insist on them having the best shot at the election. So, candidates that we all might have preferred in the beginning, but who trail in the preseason money primaries have very little chance to win the election. Of course, the media denies that role. They seem to overlook the fact that coverage of the Iowa caucuses and the early primaries way back in 1970 has created this condition. I know of very few candidates who have taken on the establishment and won without some large sums of money. And now, here's what we need to do. I have a special guest here today, and I don't want to take up any of his time. So what I suggest we do is take about a 5-minute break, and we'll be back with the Honorable William Shipp. This afternoon, I feel honored to have with us Bill Shipp, who is a prize-winning reporter and editor who's covered Southern politics and government for more than 4 decades. That's a long time. He writes a twice-weekly column that appears in more than 60 newspapers. And he's a regular panelist on the Georgia Gang, which is a weekly commentary show on news and politics on Channel 5 in Atlanta. Bill has authored 2 books, The Eighth Slayer and Other Snapshots, published in 1997, and a very popular and widely read book, which was a nonfiction piece on the 1964 murder of Atlanta Army Reservist Lieutenant Colonel Lemuel Penn by the Klan in northeast Georgia, I think in Monroe. Madison County, Georgia. He's also the managing director of Longstreet Press, which is an Atlanta-based book publisher. He is the founding editor of Bill Shipp's Georgia, a weekly newsletter that on Georgia politics and government, which appears both in print and on the web. He also was associate editor of the magazine Georgia Trend and wrote a weekly column for that magazine. And he's been a contributing editor of the Atlanta magazine. He's won many awards. In 1998, the Atlanta Press Club presented him with the prestigious Willoughby Award for a lifetime achievement in journalism. Georgia Magazine named him the best serious columnist for his essays in Atlanta Magazine and his work with Georgia Trend. In 2003, the University of Georgia's Russell Library presented the Bill and his former colleagues on the Red and Black student newspaper the 50th Anniversary Social Justice Award for their editorial opposition to segregation in 1963. Bill spent 3 decades on the staff of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, where he was associate editor, city editor, and political editor. He joined the Constitution as reporter in 1956, the year I went to work down in the Capitol a long time ago. And he's carried out assignments overseas and with great.
That's enough. I wish you was in the funeral arrangements.
Well put.
We're delighted to have you, Bill. And you're, as I mentioned, your journalistic career began with a bang when you got national attention for fighting for the right of free speech and free press at the University of Georgia. Please tell us about that.
Well, we, on the Red and Black at the time, this was a crusading student newspaper that carried on a number of crusades, including trying to clean up student housing at the University of Georgia and trying to clean up vice in Athens, which was hopeless. So the Honorable Horace Ward, who was a undergraduate of Morehouse College, attempted to enroll with the University of Georgia Law School. Since he had such good grades, we didn't see why not. And Red and Black went to war on Horace Ward's behalf to integrate with the University of Georgia Law School. That began my military career. The governor objected. The chairman of the Board of Regents, who was named Roy Harris at the time.
I remember him.
You remember him? He said, he gave an interview to Time magazine about the incident, in which he said he couldn't understand why I had not been made play football while he plays. And, anyway, the whole thing unfolded, and the red and black staff was fired, and I did join the Army, and Horace Ward was never admitted to the University of Georgia Law School, although the university paid for the scholarship for him to go to Northwestern. And he later was elected to the Georgia Senate and immediately became chairman of the university system. And he also became a judge. So anyway, that's how part of my journalistic career began. Yeah.
Did you have much contact with Roy Harris after that?
More than I wanted. Harris, in case many of you don't know, was probably most of you do, he was a major figure in Georgia politics. He was a kingmaker. And Speaker of the House, he'd come out of the liberal Ed Rivers administration, and he was really the power behind the throne, or one of the powers behind the throne in the ascension of Herman Talmadge. He was an astute politician, and later I interviewed him and learned a good bit from him later on. At the time I wrote about him, I think I knew more than when I talked to him later.
Bill, I once heard that Roy Harris once remarked that he could change the outcome of an election in 39 Georgia counties after the polls closed.
I think it's true. Which reminds me of another story about a guy who lived up here. Marvin Griffin was losing the election. I will miss the guy's name. His name was Bonnell Aiken. Marvin Griffin called. Bonnell was his major operative up here and says, "Bonnell, how many votes we got?" And Bonnell said, "How many we need?"
Bill, the mass media has come a long way since you first became a journalist. How do you think the inclusion of talk shows, television talk shows, and radio talk shows, and the internet has impacted the work of the print reporter?
Well, it's impacted more than the work of a print reporter. It has impacted the entire print news and magazine industry. You're seeing a rapid decline in the newspaper industry. And if this audience here were about 35 years younger, and I asked you to raise your hands about how many were newspaper subscribers, I doubt if I'd get more than 2 or 3 hands. But we're seeing a major shift. First beginning with the 24-hour news channels and CNN and Fox, and then you see AM radio in its last throes, trying to survive and putting in a lot of talk show people. So you've seen the whole nature of the business change. Whereas newspapers once set the agenda for news and opinion and government, you now have the entertainment industry setting the news agenda. And I'm afraid sometimes the news and information become secondary to entertainment. And I'm not sure that's good for us.
Now, here's a $64,000 question. Do you think the media manipulates views about politics and government?
Do I think the media? Absolutely. And by the same token, there's a symbiotic relationship between politics and the media. The media manipulates the politicians, and the politicians manipulate the media. I mean, you watch Fox television on one end of the spectrum, and then watch MSNBC on the other end, and you'll see the same news event, which sounds like 2 total different events by the way they're covered, with Fox generally taking the side of the Bush administration and the Republicans, and MSNBC taking the opposite tack. And it's really interesting to see how they take the same incident, the same set of facts, and see how Fox will say this is the greatest thing Bush has ever done, and MSNBC will say he's leading us down to the road of tradition. Of course, that's also in a fine tradition of newspapers, but they do it with a little more flair and a little more.
Well, since you mentioned it, there's some concern about large corporations who now control major networks. I read a statistic that says that 30 years ago, the major networks that were owned by 50 businesses. Today, it's only 5. There's some concern that compression is going to affect news and maybe be a threat to the future of the news industry. Yeah,
Well, I'm not sure about that, because if you look at the major news networks, while the ownership has declined, so have the viewers of the major TV networks. That is steadily declining. And that decline is almost in the same ratio as the increase in the popularity of the internet, where every man can be a publisher, every man can have his own newspaper, and every man can have as great a circulation as he can drum up or as good as he is. So I'm not sure. I think in a sense, rather than restricting information, you have the professionals and the big corporations declining, and information just running wild. More information than we can possibly obtain, and more information, a lot of information is not good, but there is so much information now that nobody can sponge it all up.
Bill, I've known you for a long time, and I know how you feel about freedom of the press. But I'll ask this question. You think you should go to jail for failing to reveal an unimpeachable source?
I hate to tell you this, Bob, I don't think I ought to go to jail.
Question here.
I came to Georgia in 1950, and the entire state was run as a single party, entirely Democrat. You were a Democrat or you were nothing. Today, we have another ball game. What brought it about? What was it that turned the tide to allow us to have?
You know, I want to take exception to your premise. We don't have another ball game. We got the same ball game that you first saw, except you're seeing this rapidly evolve into, if you're not a Republican, you're not anything. But the whole thing is built, if you look back then, look now, the whole thing is built essentially on race.
Amen.
That the Republican Party is a white party and the Democratic Party is a black party. In 1950, exactly the opposite was true. The Republican Party was considered the black party with a few white, what we call post office Republicans, who were white guys who hung around waiting for a Republican president to be elected so they could get a post office job. But you're seeing rapidly, if this governor's race does not turn out to be a real contest, the next governor's race you're going to see, the real race is going to be in the Republican primary. Just as in 50, the real races were in the Democratic primary, the general election was an afterthought.
Well, our first Republican representative was a senator from Savannah, as I remember. And that broke the ice, apparently, and changed the attitude of the state.
Well, Mathematically, was who you're thinking about.
Yes.
He beat Talmadge in 1980, one of the great upsets. And Talmadge had thought he'd already had his big contest in the Democratic primary that year when he defeated Zell Miller. But as it turned out, Zell Miller had only softened him up for the general election. Talmadge had a number of personal problems. Mattingly beat him, and that was the beginning of genuine two-party politics, but it was also the beginning of an evolution back to one-party politics. You can really trace the rise of the Republican Party to back to Lyndon Johnson, the signing of civil rights legislation, and the rise of Barry Goldwater. A lot of Southerners said the Democratic Party no longer represents no longer represents my views or my interests. And so, and now Republicans, first enunciated by Goldwater and later by a lot of others, seem to represent the views of more white people, particularly white males. Democrats have already lost nearly all white males, or a huge percentage of them.
Thank you.
I hope I answered the question.
I was just going to say, Lyndon Johnson acknowledged that he was doing that.
He did. The day he signed the Voting Rights Act, he turned to somebody and said that means the South will go Republican for years to come.
Right.
And he was dead on.
Absolutely correct.
Well, getting back to Georgia politics, turning the clock back to 1960, which I always felt was really the turning point in the establishment. We saw the integration of the schools, we saw the demise of the county unit system. We had an election during the 60s, nobody won, but the Supreme Court, and it was a very traumatic experience. How did we survive?
You started about the state. We had a series of very enlightened governors, in my judgment. And in 1962, I guess, we had something in the state called the county unit system. It was tossed out. It meant that I won't go into the complexities of it, but it generally meant that the rural Democrats controlled state government. It was tossed out that year, and Carl Sanders became the first popularly elected governor. And he was elected by a coalition of whites and blacks. And that coalition held together and kept Democrats in office most of the time, up until Roy Barnes was defeated 4 years ago. And Roy Barnes' defeat, ironically, in my judgment anyway, was caused in large part by the black part of that coalition demanding a change in the flag, which broke up the coalition probably for the foreseeable future.
Well, let me mention to you, I had prepared to mention to you a series of names of governors to get your opinion on. All right, beginning with Ernest Banner.
He's probably the most courageous governor in my memory. Ernest Banner ran on a platform of no, not one, meaning we will not integrate the public schools. And as I recall, either implied strongly or said, we will close the public schools before we integrate them. I think he did not think the crisis was going to occur on his watch, but the whole thing did blow up on his watch. And he did seems to be the magnanimous thing. He helped he staged hearings around the state on whether to close the public schools, came to the conclusion the public did not want them closed, and Ernest Banner stepped up to the bat and said, I've changed my mind, we will not close public schools. And one of his aides at the time said, to paraphrase the great British Prime Minister, said there will be peace in our time. And sure enough, Georgia, if you will look back at the turbulent civil rights era, although there was a lot of trouble here and some violence, Georgia led the way. It was easily the most progressive states in the Southeast, in my opinion. And you would say that's because we got the big hearts and we're more intelligent. No, that's because Coca-Cola and Delta and a lot of the little multinational corporations were headquartered in Atlanta, and they fully recognized that having a big fight over racial matters was not good for business.
And I recall Governor Banner led the charge to repeal 77 Jim Crow laws that he pushed through the legislature without very many of his friends in the party. I remember that there were 3 people who actually backed him originally in that position. One was Carl Sanders, who was his floor leader. One was Frank Twitty.
Right.
And one was Zell Miller.
That is correct.
Who stood up on the floor of the Senate and said that nothing is bad enough to close the public school.
Carl Sanders.
Probably when you talk, Jimmy Carter made the cover of Time magazine as the first of the New South governors. But Carl Sanders was really the first of the New South governors, in which he put together that coalition of blacks and whites and took the urban vote into the big tent of government. And in 4 years, he did what we have had a number of governors did not even approach doing in 8 years. Among his signal achievements was overhauling the university system of Georgia and trying to bring it into the 20th century. And also he established a series of airports throughout the state, and he made economic development his #1 priority. And he also projected the right image for the state, which in my opinion is very important.
What year was this?
This was in 62 through 66. He was succeeded by Lester Maddox.
Who is next on the list? Lester
Well,
Maddox.
Maddox is probably the most interesting governor we've ever had. He was an unapologetic segregationist. He ran a restaurant in Atlanta, and he ran a very strong campaign for governor, although he was not elected. If we had had a plurality of the vote, Bo Calloway would have been the first Republican governor in the state. But because no one won a plurality because someone else had a write-in vote, Maddox was thrown, he went to the legislature, and the legislature elected Lester Maddox almost solely because he was a Democrat, but partly because he was also about segregation.
Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy Carter ran as a segregationist. And I remember sitting in it, and he had almost every say in the state. He ran against Carl Sanders, who was trying to make a comeback. And all the segregationists were sitting out in the audience, and Carter made his inaugural address. And I remember sitting behind him and looking out, and Carter said, "The time has come for us to put aside racial differences." And he made this integrationist address, and he looked down at these people in their face and just fell. But it established him, that speech established him as a national figure. And he made the cover of Time magazine, and of course he ran for president.
George Bush.
A very good governor, a low-key governor, the first of the modern 8-year term governors. He served successive terms. He also made economic development the key to his administration, and he loved Japanese cameras.
Joe Frank Harris.
Joe Frank Harris was the second one of the 8-year governors, and he appointed my friend George Berry over there, who was the economic development commissioner. He kept the boat very steady, and the economy did well, and he was I give him a this be was.
I'm gonna save the next one until later.
Miller.
You worked for years with Tom Murphy, who was Speaker of the House for many, many years. Was he the booger bear that most people were led to believe?
Yes, he was. He was really, Tom Murphy was the caricature in many ways of the political boss, the guys who made things work, the guys who kept discipline in the House. And he and I were at odds a lot of times when I was an editorial writer at college newspaper. But I later came to appreciate a lot of things he did, which I think would help the state a great deal. We might not have major league sports, certainly not a professional football team in Atlanta, it would not have been for Tom Murphy. But he was rude and crude and tough.
But liked.
Oh, mostly like it.
like Denmark Group.
Denmark Brewer was from Macon, one of the great parliamentarians in the Georgia legislature, and one of the few legislators I ever knew who read all the bills. He was an exemplary legislator. Too bad we don't have any like him today.
He is the reason for a term they call grooverizing, which meant if your bill had been grooverized, then it was all right.
That's right. Been cleaned up.
Culver Kid.
Culver Kid was known as the Silver Fox. He had, as you can imagine, silver hair, and he wore sport coats that were made out of wrappers from, what was that record?
Crown Royal.
From Crown Royal. He was one of the great clowns in the Senate. He showed up once for the opening of the Senate wearing a Roman toga with two ladies of the evening on each side. And once he brought one of these ladies into the House chamber, and Celestine Sibley, the columnist of the paper, saw her and went over to her and started whispering, and they started looking around the House chamber and pointing to various people. And the speaker, who was George L. Smith, had her arrested and taken from the chamber before she could identify too many folks.
Walter Brooks.
Walter Brooks was the brains behind Vandenberg, in my opinion, and the man who saw, he was the one who saw that the state could not go down the path that Alabama and Mississippi had gone down, that we need to preserve our public education and keep the peace as much as possible. And he was the behind-the-scenes architect. Short knows this better than I. He was behind-the-scenes architect of let's get out of this and save the public school system. He also, though, was the brains behind Herman Talmadge and put out that scurrilous newspaper called The Statesman. Right?
He did, he sure did. He was a great fellow. I really love the guy. He was a great man. Now, let's talk a little bit about Republicans. Many people are unfamiliar with the stars of the Republican Party. Who are some?
Well, the modern Republican Party, of course, you've got Senator Perdue, who came out of nowhere in the governor's race and won the all-time upsets. But you've got a lot of Republicans who came before that probably no one now remembers, like Bob Bell, who was the DeKalb County guy, who was the chairman of the party for many years. And in that time, the Republicans represented a more urban bend, and they were the party of reform, and very often the more progressive party. But they could afford to be progressive because they were the minority and going to be in the minority for as long as anybody could see.
What do you think caused Georgia voters to switch from years of Democratic control over Republican?
Well, I think the public catalyst, what we saw was that Governor Roy Barnes said he wanted to change the flag. That flew in the face of what a lot of people thought. Zell Miller, just 8 years earlier, had almost been beaten on the same issue. When Barnes set out, there was a feeling that he had gone too far in trying to please the minority. But that was only one facet. The polls showed that Georgians wanted massive reform in their public schools. The polls showed that, but election day showed that is not what they wanted. Because Barnes set out to reform the public schools, and public school teachers and school administrators overwhelmingly voted against it. Although he had given sizable raises to teachers and educators, he had also imposed restrictions and started to demand accountability. And I think that was also a major factor in his collapse.
Question.
Why do you think there's been such a or there is such a contrast between the local Democratic philosophy the state philosophy and the national. It seems to get more liberal as you go up the step. And why is that happening and why did it happen?
You know, we talk about liberal and conservative. Let me ask you, if you could define a liberal, and in my view, a liberal is one who spends an awful lot of money, who engages in national adventures, who borrows a lot of money, who creates new layers of government. And who did I just describe?
George W. Bush.
Not only George W. Bush, but you see this happening in the state level. Look at all these new towns springing up in Georgia, new levels of government. We also have a record budget. So when you see words like conservative and liberal, they become propaganda words. If you're my buddy, you're a conservative. But if you're not my buddy, you must be a liberal. So, I mean, those words have become almost meaningless. Except in the South, when somebody says he's conservative, that is really code in many circles for being pro-white. And if he says you're a liberal, that means you're too far the other way, you're too left, too racially oriented. In fact, in some parts of Georgia, blacks are referred to as Democrats. So, I don't know whether that answers your question or not.
Well, you can't lay it all on a racial basis.
No, you can't relay it all on race, but that is an underlying, I've looked at this for 50 years, and I can tell you that is an underlying theme of everything. You can talk about changing a street name, you can talk about installing a new water main in Atlanta, or building a new highway through Blairsville. You dig deep enough into that issue, and if it's in the South, race will have something to do with it somewhere in there.
Amen. Amen.
Yes, sir.
I want to raise a question about possibilities for financial reform and election. We live in a time when the Constitution mandates elections, both state and national constitution. And the only way the candidates can be known is through the media. It seems to me that the media, and they serve their purpose, mutual purpose, but the media has a vested interest in elections because the cost of advertising is a big support of the media. And is there not a controversy there when the media is able to, in running stories about candidates, if things are too calm, they can run stories that fire it up, and then the candidates have to answer by buying more ads. I mean, there's a place where the media has a part into what are the issues, and in order to answer the issues, the candidate has to buy advertising in order to promote his campaign. Is there any way, and then too, in order to produce income for elections, we have a cozy arrangement between administrations and corporations so that, for example, gas can be sold at $3 a gallon and get a nice cushion to be able to buy the next election, and then the gas prices fall here 40 days before the election, probably to go up before Christmas. And you have this arrangement with business and administrations to get the enormous amount of income you have to run a campaign. Is there any way we can come to a place where you could have campaign finance reform so that you could allocate a certain amount of money for it? Is there any way we could do that and not take away freedom of press and inquiry?
Well, I tell you, you need somebody much higher than my pay grade to answer those questions. But you raise an interesting point. But the point you raised about news coverage, firing up campaigns, I think that was once true. I'm not sure it does now. What fires up campaigns is candidate A will have $20 million. He will buy a television spot saying candidate B is a no-good bum. Candidate B doesn't have $20 million to answer him, the chance of candidate B winning diminishes appreciably. There are exceptions to that rule, but most elections now are fought out, not in the unpaid media, but as you suggest, in the paid media, and who has the most money to buy the most TV
Well, that's why people become so cynical about it. I mean,
Well,
we see
you're
that.
exactly right, and I don't know what the answer is. One answer has been suggested to me is take all the restrictions off financial. Just make it very public about where everybody is getting their money. But I don't think that's the answer either. Because I think, as you suggest, the big corporations can buy the candidates and manipulate policy, as in the case of gas and other things, to change the outcome of the election. And I think you're going to see that in midterm congressional races. Democrats say, oh, yeah, we're going to win. I don't think they're going to win. I think the Republicans are going to prevail because suddenly the winds are going to be seen to be blowing in the right direction on the price of oil, on whatever's happening in
I was
the
hoping you had the answer. I was hoping you had the answer.
I'm sorry. Above me.
Right, yes.
How much did Newt Gingrich and the Republican Revolution in '94 influence Georgia thinking in politics?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the end of the question.
How much did Newt Gingrich and the Republican Revolution in '94 influence Georgia politics, or was it
Well, a
related?
great deal, and then Newt Gingrich became the star of Georgia's political spectrum for a very short time. But also that entire revolution kind of showed what could happen if a guy showed up on a white horse with a charter in his hand and says, follow me. And they did follow him for a while, and the Republicans, after a long drought, took over the Congress and this infected Georgia a great deal. Did reapportionment, gerrymandered. When I say Republicans gerrymandered, I'm not saying that was just Republicans did that. They learned how to do it from the Democrats before them to maintain control. Gingrich had a great impact. Gingrich is now trying to make a comeback and run for president. But 3 wives later, I don't think he's going to.
Bill, I take it that you were surprised that Purdue defeated Roy Moore.
I was very surprised, which brings up another problem in polling. See all these polls all the time, that this is going to happen, and this is going to happen. Well, all the polls, even the good ones, showed that Roy Barnes was going to win and win by a wide margin. And that turned out not to be the case. It turned out not to be the case because there was a huge turnout in southeast Georgia of rural voters with no pollster anticipating would go and voted en masse against Barnes. And there were some people who said earlier that Barnes, without naming Purdue, that Barnes was subject to defeat because he had made too many various segments of the electorate angry with it. We had not only the teachers, not only the Southern Heritage Group, the law enforcement was mad at him. Here was a guy who tried to do, seems to me, he tried to do too much without ever thinking about the politics of what he was trying to do.
Sheriff Freeman analyzed it this way. Roy Barnes lost because he made everybody mad at the same time.
Great announcement. It was dead on.
Now, getting back to our list of governors, Sonny Perdue.
I think Sonny Perdue has not done a great deal in his first term. And I think he tried not to do, I think he made a conscious effort not to achieve a great deal because he saw the errors of Roy Barnes and he was determined not to be Roy Barnes. If he is elected to a second term, I hope he does not maintain that course. A lot needs to be done in this state. The state is crying out for some activist leadership in education, in environmental protection, higher education. traffic congestion, you name it, we need some help. We need some help.
Is he a shoe-in for a second term?
I wouldn't say he's a shoe-in, but if I were a betting man, I'd sure bet on him. He has got that $20 million I mentioned, he's got that $20 million. He's spending it pretty wisely on advertising, in my judgment. The Sunny Dune, which is promising all kinds of things. Bart Taylor does not answer him effectively. If you let that kind of campaign go on, by the time you decide that answer is too late, because Sonny Perdue has already established his own identity. Bart Taylor, it seems to me, should have gone on the attack. He should establish Sonny Perdue's identity, but that isn't.
May I please ask a question out of sheer ignorance? Is there any political or background substance to Mark Freeland? To me, he's just a big fat guy in a newspaper photo.
See, you just pointed out why I would bet on the other guy. I think that is the image he projects. You see these things in the paper about his father, paid his way and did all these things for him. And unhappily, the image you state is what he projects, and I think that's why he among others.
Do you see in the Democratic Party the leadership that you just defined?
No. I don't see any bench in the Democratic Party unless you go down to Jim Marshall, who's a congressman, fighting for his life now for re-election against Matt Collins, who is a Republican trying to make a comeback. Marshall, I had to say that, I'm going to say it anyway, he's very much in the cut of Zell Miller, in which he suddenly is a Democrat running to the right. If you do that, some of these Republicans, and he's a war hero, and he's just everything it seems to be. He's also a former Mercer professor, former mayor of Macon. Seems to me the Democrats are going to have to come up with that kind of candidate. But if I were looking into the future, I'd look at what kind of bench the Republicans have, because that's where your leaders of the future are coming from.
Yes, ma'am.
Shouldn't we note that Sonny Perdue was a Democrat to begin with and turned Republican?
Shouldn't we note that most of these Republicans were Democrats and turned Republicans? They will tell you they didn't turn Republicans. The Democratic Party left now.
You sound like Sal Miller's book, On National Party No More.
Don't say that.
Yes, sir.
No, we're looking at the macro picture. Let's look at a micro picture of the media, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution today, the cartoon. Did you see that? The picture of George Allen. What the hell has he got to do with Georgia politics? Being portrayed as a clownsman with a flag. This is the first time anybody has attacked George Allen in any race he's had for governor or senator before this, and they're going after him now because he was going to try to be a national figure, which I don't think he could have gotten anyway, but still, they're trying to zero in on him now as a racist. All of a sudden, why?
I don't make policy of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, but the national press is zeroed in on George Allen, probably because of that array of Republican presidential hopefuls. He suddenly began to falter and started to make mistakes. A lot of mistakes which we've made in the past are now being uncovered, and he's being chipped away as a potential presidential candidate. And I also think that there's at least a reasonable chance he's going to be beaten in the Senate race.
Yeah, but
you
that's
asked me why the
Republican.
Cox newspapers in Atlanta chose to do that. If you had asked me that in 1987, I would have told you, but I don't have any idea.
Bill, you and I, as well as our friends, have voiced a few from time to time.
We have.
Over the years, you've had what I have observed to be sort of a love-hate relationship with the senator. Are you boys speaking nowadays?
I'm not sure. I haven't spoken to him in a long time. But let me say that his tenure as governor was a very good one in the state. He did a lot of good things. The Hope Scholarship was more than just a lottery and paying tuitions. That reinvigorated in-state colleges and in-state higher education. So that Georgia, at least for a short time, shot way ahead of most of the other states, with the exception probably in North Carolina and Virginia. But enrollment went up, the schools suddenly had more money to do things with, bring in more and better faculty. Miller did a lot. Miller was a really good governor. Too bad he lost his mind when he mentioned civics.
I think that you did not write his speech to the Republican convention.
I did not, but I watched it with disbelief.
Question? Richard?
Bill, I have read in the last several years, the time that I've had now in retirement, particularly retirement out of politics, that if you go back in history, it would seem to me that the only difference today in the way politics is carried out and electioneering is carried out is that the electronic media particularly gets in everybody's face 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Very little has changed in the core way that politics is carried out. Do you agree with that or disagree with that?
No, I agree with that. I think if you look back at the turn of the century, you can see that politics was carried out in much the same way. Politicians today manipulate television. Politicians in that time manipulated newspapers. The same issues stated in different ways. Taxes is still a major issue. One set of politicians, incumbents, always set out to scare the hell out of the elected. So if you don't want to change horses, no telling what might happen if you brought these other things. All that is staying the same. So, but the media changed the techniques, the electronic media changed the techniques. And you're going to see those techniques change further as the internet becomes more and more important. In fact, you can see fundraising already changed. Instead of direct mail and telephones, you can see the internet is going to be the big medium used to raise money in the future. Because it works, and it works very well, better than other means.
It didn't work very well for Howard Dean. He raised a lot of money.
He raised a lot of money, and he kind of set the pattern that's being refined now. And you see people in state and local races beginning to raise money.
He made a mistake when he made his I Have a Scream speech in Highland. But he did really, he is very innovative. Joe Trickey and those people did a wonderful job using the internet. I'm sure that that's going to be a great campaign technique in the future.
How much influence does the New York Times have on our country?
I'm sorry about the New York Times.
How much influence does it have on our country?
New York Times has a great deal of influence. Back in my daily newspaper days, we would pull the front page budget of the New York Times off the wire every day we came in and make certain that every story, national, international story represented on page 1 of the New York Times was in the A section of the Atlanta papers. They still do that. And I'm not sure that's a good thing, but they set the agenda. They set the agenda for television. You can bet television does it. But the New York Times, in my view, and I tend to agree with them more than I disagree with them, but they have become so partisan. I don't think they're the great newspaper that they once were.
Don't lose track of the fact what the New York Times owns. They own the St. Petersburg Times. They own another, the Sarasota Herald Tribune. They own the Boston Globe, which used to be the Taylor family situation, which was, in its day, much more conservative. And I'm sure that their reach goes, I don't know this for a fact, but their reach, I would suppose, goes into somewhat of the Midwest newspapers.
So they made a foray into Georgia, and I worked for them for a while.
Yeah, yeah.
and turned it into a first-class newspaper. And then they had to retrench, and you saw them fall back. But you're also seeing newspapers all over the country, not the Times so far, but other big newspapers retrench. Knight Ridder, which owns a lot of newspapers, including the one in Philadelphia, they own the Macon paper and the Columbus paper, they're selling out. They're selling the newspaper interest to the McClatchy family. The Tribune is selling the Los Angeles Times. And I think you're gonna see the New York Times retrench too. And as the newspapers retrench, I think you're gonna see their influence diminish.
Well, as you indicated earlier, people are reading less and less and less as us old timers fade out of the picture.
Right.
The young people between 18 and 34 probably don't look at the newspaper once a week.
I look beyond 34. I don't read a newspaper except this.
But I'm wondering this though, when I see my own habits and the habits of my kids and grandkids, they do look at the news, and sometimes they look at newspaper sites, but those sites are on the internet.
Oh, yeah.
Right, I mean, one of the most visited sites on the internet is the New York Times site. Now, those big news organizations, as they maintain their professionalism, they've got to find out a way that they can make as much money off the internet as they're making off dead trees. Right.
In defense of the internet, it has opened up opportunity for small contributors to make a difference in opposition to the corporate donations. I mean, you can $25, $50, and $100 contributors from a lot of people on the internet mount up and give another voice, don't they, to the, instead of all the money, big money coming from.
Oh, absolutely. I think the internet is a great thing. After I left the Atlanta newspapers, I started a paper newsletter that did all right. But when the internet began to open up in the 1990s, we went up with an internet edition, with what looked like what they call blogs today. And then we began to make some money. And we started from nothing. And then finally I sold the operation. But you're absolutely right. That opens up for a greater diversity of information and opinion, although a lot of it is hot air. Some of it I've generated.
Yes.
Can the Washington Post have a balance to the New York Times with too much?
Well, everybody always talks about the Post and the New York Times. The Post is in a different category. It is a company newspaper. It's a company town newspaper. It is a newspaper put out, if the Washington Post were put out in a mill town, it would be writing about the products put out in that mill. The Washington Post is the house organ for the federal government. It ought to be viewed that it is not really a rival to the Times. The real rival to the Times is the Wall Street Journal, which does a magnificent job of news coverage and an absolutely abominable job on the advertising.
And no funny page.
Dale, final witness. Yes, sir.
Will you prognosticate on this coming election as to whether the Democrats who think they have got it won already will in fact do that?
No, I don't hold me to this. I do not think they will take either house. And I think that's because a lot of these polls are being done as national polls. These House elections and Senate elections, they're local races. And if you look at the congressional quarterly, they're picking these things apart district by district. It's a far different picture than what you're getting in the national. The poll nationally may say, we all hate the Iraq war and we hate the Bush policies in Iraq, and therefore we're going to elect at least 6 Democratic senators. People are not thinking in national terms. You say those dirty rats in congressmen, those dirty rats in Congress, they are corrupt and I hate them, but not my congressman, not my senator. He's not like the rest of them. So I don't think that the majority is going to change.
Well, reducing that to Georgia, do you think that Purdue is going to win the election?
Yeah.
Do you think his coattail will be broad enough to take the whole slate of constitutional officers in the office?
No. In fact, I don't know how much coattails he has. I do think that Casey Cagle is probably going to win on the basis of the thrust he had in defeating Ralph Reed. But I think on down the ballot, you will see the Democrats continue to win. Mainly because I don't think the Republicans really focus on those down ballot races.
Do you think Ralph Reed has any future left in Georgia
It'd be
politics?
tough for Ralph Reed to run again. Ralph Reed, it seems to me, made a strategic error in that, as Carl Sanders once said of Bob Short, a brain surgeon should never try to operate on his own brain. He met a successful political consultant or a staff not run for elective office. I think that was a basic mistake Reed made. The other basic mistake he made was hanging around too much on K Street, but that's other enough.
Well, let's talk about where you're going to, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to ask, what do you see today in the picture that would encourage anyone to enter politics or commercial district?
You know, you may have hit on why we have a class of politicians we have now. I like to think in the old days that people like Guthman and people like that ran for public office to do a public service, to give something back to their community, to contribute something to the common weal. I'm not sure you have that motivation now. And most of these people are either running to represent some special interest, or they see financial opportunity, and that's at almost every level. Look at some of these corruption cases in Congress now. Absolutely shocking to me. This guy on the West Coast, what was his name? Yeah. I mean, that kind of thing just baffles you.
It's a very well paid job.
That's right.
Let me follow up that question. Do you suppose that good people are not running for public office because they do not want to be savaged by the press?
Absolutely not.
Any other questions of Mr. Shipp? Yes, sir.
Carl Sanders, when we came to Georgia in 1966, he was a shining light, but his flame has gone down ever since he lost the primary. Carl Sanders.
Carl Sanders.
Why is he so well thought of by the academia and the smart people, but he never can be elected to anything in Georgia again?
Well, Sanders, of course, has gotten older and he's gone on to become a very wealthy lawyer. But when he ran his second term for governor, his handlers ruined that word. His handlers did not do him well, and they ran a campaign with the motto, Carl Sanders ought to be governor again. He was running against Carter, and that killed him.
But you know, Bill, I would say this, that maybe Carl Sanders ought to have been governor again, because maybe Jimmy Carter ought to have been governor in 1966.
Oh, that raises the whole history of the world. If Jimmy Carter had been elected in 1966, then everything would be different. Jimmy Carter would never have run for the presidency. Carl Sanders might have gone on to seek national office as a U.S. senator. I mean, we could write a novel about that. And Carter would not have gone on to be one of the most despised people in the state.
In response to Wally's comment about Carl Sanders had Lyndon Johnson tied around his neck as his campaign manager in 1964. So that's the answer largely, I think, to that question.
Well, at one point, Lyndon Johnson had dangled in front of Carl Sanders, this is a well-circulated report, that he might tap Sanders to become his running mate. Of course, he dangled that prize before Ivan Allen and before every other Southerner that you could speak of here. But Sanders thought he had a real national future. A lot of other people thought that he had a national future. And then he looked at the polls and at one point thought of challenging Senator Russell and looked at the polls and said, God told him not to run.
That's mine.
I was gonna ask you if you have not a weekly, but an overall winner and loser? You can tell I watch your program on Sundays.
And overall,
Yeah, the winners and
Winners and
Who's the
losers.
winner? Who's your winner this week?
No, not a weekly, but an overall in the history of, in Georgia political history.
oh, in Georgia's political history, I would say that Carl Sanders becomes close to being a winner because he set the stage. He established a different tone of the state government. He took the state away from the wool hats. The wool hats being the traditional racist, white citizens people. He put that ahead of everything, and he made the state, he set the state out on an economic development basis to increase the literacy of the state and to make the quality of our life better. That's my winner. Too many losers.
Too many losers. That's it.
You know, those of us who worked with Sanders had this, had our own hats, instead of wool hats, we wore snout brims.
I remember that.
Just a little reference there. Any more questions?
If things continue as they are now, if things continue as they are now, do you foresee a possibility of a third party in 2008 making a significant difference?
Yeah, I think a third party could make a significant difference. You can make a case that Bill Clinton would never have been president had there not been a substantial third party candidate. You find, and again, I knock the polls, but you see the polls showing more and more that Americans and Georgians are disenchanted with both parties, with neither party quite.
That's why I asked the question.
So if a third party candidate rises, that third party candidate probably can't be elected, but could swing the election one way or the other.
Any other questions of Mr. Shipp? Yes, sir.
What are the registration, what's the registration for voters in Georgia like now?
42 and 42, the other being on the other. So you fought for the other, the independent votes.
Other questions of Mr. Shipp?
I want to raise one other related to Barnes' defeat and bringing it back to the power of the media. And I appreciate what you had to say about the reasons we think he was defeated. I also had the impression, though, that his political ads really turned a lot of people off.
They did.
It seemed to me that if he had had better people creating those ads, he came across to so many people as being a little bit on the arrogant side in the way that boasted about his accomplishments, this sort of thing.
Well, I agree with that. And he had substantial amounts of money. If you go back and look at those ads, it was Roy Barnes in front of Barnes store in Mapleton. And Roy Barnes, what a wonderful history he had. That kind of ad was nice. He got any kind of threat at all. He ran as if he had no threat. As it turned out, he had one that took him out. You need to, if you're going to do political advertising, you need to scare the voters. You need to let the voters know, I can save you. If you don't vote for me, you may not get saved. He didn't do that.
Bill, one final question. What happened to Kathy Cox?
To whom?
Catherine, see, you already forgot. Kathy Cox is, was going to be the great bright hope in Georgia. She was a breath of fresh air. She was going to run a different kind of campaign. At last, Georgia was ready to elect a progressive woman as governor, and her campaign fell apart, and she had terrible ads. scandal after another. Turned out just to be not, it's such a poor candidate that at least I had the impression at the end, she didn't want to win, and she was happy she didn't win. I don't, unless I'm surprised, I think that's it.
I hope you noticed that nobody asked you a question about Hillary Clinton this afternoon.
If you had asked me about her, I would have told you, I think she's going to be the Democratic nominee. But I didn't say she was going to win the election.
We're gonna have to cut it off now. Maybe one other, you take another question?
I would like to know, Kathy Cox, was, the great woman hope of the Democratic Party. What about Handel from DeKalb County? Is she gonna be the next Republican nominee for governor? The Secretary of State.
You say Handel?
Handel?
Here.
Yeah, she's got a good chance. She's going to be Secretary of State. I think she's going to win that race. That's going to be a pretty tight race.
Really?
And she is, she's a Republican, she's quite conservative. I will tell you though, and this, I'm not comparing her to Linda Srinko, because I once thought that Linda Srinko would be the great. Didn't work out.
Was that before or after the facelift?
It was before.
Positively, the last question.
One mystery man that was left out, and he's tied in with Barnes somehow. What happened to Lieutenant Governor Pierre Howell?
He dropped off the face of the earth. No, as a matter of fact, he's working with Matt Towery in a public relations and polling firm called Insider Advantage. And I get an email from him occasionally, but he's out of the public eye, and he's very bitter about a lot of things that happened in his career that he thinks were not of his doing.
Yeah, it happened in a week's time.
Well,
I mean, it was.
well, it really happened in 4 years' time. He thought he was going to be elected to lieutenant governor, and he misheard someone say that he thought they were going to retire after 4 years, and he was going to run again. Didn't work out that way, and a lot of other things. He was prepared to run for governor. Some opposition research people dug up some things in his past that caused him to leave the scene. He was really a good candidate. He was a good public servant. I think it's a real loss that he dropped out.
Bill, thank you very much.
Thank you.